afternoon. It's a pleasure welcoming Dr. Amir Ali for a session on There Ain't No Black in Brexit. Dr. Ali teaches at the Center for Political Studies, JNU. Previously, he taught at the Department of Political Science, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, from 2004 to 2007, and was Agatha Harrison Memorial Visiting Fellow at St. Antony's College, Oxford, from 2012 to 2014. His areas of research are multiculturalism, group rights, and British politics. He has published a book on South Asian Islam and British multiculturalism. His new book on Brexit and Liberal Democracy, Populism, Sovereignty and Nation State will be published by Routledge in July 2021. You're welcome, Dr. Amir Ali. You have up to 3 hours for the session. You can conduct it however you like to. Sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Azad. First of all, let me thank you, Azad, and the Dialogue Foundation for inviting me and for having me be part of this. Let me just plunge in straight away. Let me also say that I intend to speak for around 40 to 45 minutes, and I've always enjoyed it when people ask questions, so I'm always better at trying to answer questions, and hopefully I'll be able to answer questions to the best of my ability. The title of my talk is There Ain't No Black in Brexit. The title is actually taken from, there's a very famous book by a very famous academic as well, Paul Gilroy. It's called There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. And I've tried to adapt that particular title for the purposes of my talk, which is There Ain't No Black in Brexit. My attempt today will be to talk about the Brexit process, not by getting into the intricacies of British politics, which might bore people. A lot of what I'm going to be saying is pretty much based on my book, which should be out, as Behzad was saying a little while ago, in July. By July, it should be out. But I want to talk about the iniquities of the Brexit process. I want to look at it as a particular kind of response to globalization, which in many ways is very similar to what is happening across the pond, as it's called. The Atlantic Ocean, as is very fondly referred to by the British and the Americans on either side. So I want to compare it to what is going on in the horror of the 4 years of Donald Trump that we've seen in America, hopefully, which should be over very soon. And finally, I would want to look at Brexit for the purposes, especially of this kind of a discussion, as a kind of a complete breakdown of dialogue within a democracy and how Brexit could actually represent a threat to the process of democracy itself. So let me just reiterate my 3 major concerns once again for people. Let me also say that I have a really bad habit of speaking very fast. A lot of my students complain about this, and the only thing I can say is that it's one of those habits that I've never been able to kind of correct. So even if I'm slow, I tend to kind of quicken pace. So if there's something which I'm saying too fast or people can't understand me, just tell me that what I said didn't make sense or you couldn't understand. I'll try to say it again. But in terms of laying out the ground for my discussion today is, as I said, I want my title is an adaptation of the title of Paul Gilroy's book, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, a very, very famous book that was, I think, first published in 1987. And then there was a reissue in 2002. The second point that I made about my discussion very broadly is that it aims to look at the iniquities and the anomalies and the problems within the Brexit process. And thirdly, I intend to look at this as I said, as a kind of a response to globalization and the problems that globalization has created for what are often referred to as advanced, first world advanced capitalist societies like the US and the UK, which have suffered from the ravages of deindustrialization, the loss of manufacturing, and the final point, which I really want to emphasize, is how I look at Brexit as a complete breakdown of the possibility of dialogue. And I often consider dialogue to be a very, very important part of democracy. So when I try to conclude and sum up, I will look at how Brexit possibly poses a threat to a democracy like the UK, which is considered to be a pretty stable democracy, a country which considers itself to be the home of the rule of law, and all these other assets. So 3 or 4 kind of broad points that I wanted to make at the very beginning to kind of give people a sense of the lay of the land and how I want to talk about Brexit. The term Brexit itself is very interesting. It was coined by someone called Dennis McShane, who is a Labour MP, who's also written a book called Brexiternity, which I was recently reading. Obviously, it refers to the exit of Britain from the European Union. So you have different kinds of different versions of countries wanting to or aspiring to exit the European Union. Brexit, of course, the possibility of Greece exiting the European Union around 2015. There was a referendum there. Frexit, France, some people wanting to leave the European Union. Of course, Brexit happened in 2015. 2016 was when the referendum happened, 23rd of June 2016. Of course, those of you who've been following the news will know that the deal was struck on the 23rd of December, which was just 7 days before the deadline. The deadline was the 31st of December 2020. So it was pretty much a cliffhanger, this last minute negotiations and so on and so forth. But as I said, this aspiration or this desire, this yearning to leave the European Union that Brexit and its other variants are all about. Let me kind of go into why some countries want to leave an entity like the European Union. Now, those of you who know, I don't want to get into the European Union and what it is all about and so on. It all began in 1957. I think it's the Treaty of Rome back in 1957, and of course you had the coal and steel community and so on and so forth. But let me not get into all of that. The one point that I would want to make, and one reason why someone like me considers the European Union to be a worthy project, is that it's an organization that understands the dangers of resurgent renaissance nationalisms. Europe as a continent was ravaged during the Second World War because of nationalisms gone completely rampant. And a lot of people who understand Europe, who understand the continent, the architects of this kind of European unification project, understood that what nationalism does, nationalism gone to the extremes, is that it can tear apart continents, it can tear apart countries, it can tear apart peoples, because, as I said a little while ago, renascent or nationalisms on the rampage have a certain kind of a danger in terms of tearing societies and peoples apart. So the point that I'm really making is that the European Union is a worthwhile project in the sense that it understands the dangers of these nationalisms. It understands what Europe went through during the Second World War, and all the divisions that happened. And therefore, it brought together nations together in this particular way. And there was a kind of a pooling of sovereignty, which a lot of nations agree with. Now, this is where the British don't agree. They consider themselves to be an island nation. They have their own peculiarities. One of those peculiarities is the desire to kind of go it alone, not kind of go along with Europe. So what I'm suggesting is that this particular desire to strike out on their own has two sources to it. One is the kind of pull from across the Atlantic, which is the American pull. Most Brexiteers are Europhobes. That is, there's a certain kind of fear of Europe that they have. At the same time, there's a certain kind of, this love of America. And a lot of Brexiteers will simultaneously express a certain kind of fear of a fear of Europe, and at the same time express a certain kind of a yearning and a desire to be close to America. So that's one root of, or one manifestation of Brexit, if I can call it that. Another manifestation of Brexit, quite remarkably, especially if you look at it from our part of the world, sitting in India as a former colony and perhaps the most preeminent colony, the jewel in the crown as it was called, was the desire for Britain to reconnect with the Commonwealth. Those countries that were once part of the British Empire, and the fabled idea that the sun never set on the British Empire, and so on and so forth. So it's quite strange that, and I find it a very strange kind of a political tendency that would want to distance itself from its closest neighbors. Europe is just across the English Channel; it's not very far away. But the desire to kind of distance from Europe, and to this kind of a yearning to be closer to America, which is, it's a 7-hour flight from the UK, and there's a whole vastness of the Atlantic Ocean that separates Britain from the US in the West, and also this very strange sudden desire to kind of rekindle ties with the Commonwealth, and where Brexiteers will always suggest that there's a certain kind of affinity that Britain has with its former colonies. There's no love for that thing, of course, in our part of the world. We all know what the British did to a country like ours, India, and the ravaging of Indian textile industries and the drain of wealth and so on and so forth. But it seems that a lot of Brexiteers have really got their history wrong, and were they to come knocking in terms of wanting to kind of establish a certain kind of a link that is reminiscent of the empire, I'm sure that many of us in this country would tell us that they're just not welcome at all. But as I said, these are manifestations of Brexit. The desire not to be too close to Europe, the desire to be close to America, and simultaneously the desire to rekindle, a very nostalgic desire to rekindle these old associations of the British Empire. And of course, we have very horrific memories of that empire for very valid reasons in terms of everything, the many wrongs and injustices that were committed. It reminds me of the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, who once said that it's never a good idea not to be at peace with who one's neighbors are. Not being comfortable with your own neighbors is perhaps a manifestation of a very particular kind of unhappiness, and I think that's something which clearly Brexit represents. The unhappiness with the people who are in your immediate proximity, Europe. The fact that Europe constitutes a major market for British exports, I forget the figure, but I mean, Europe is really the major market for British exports, the major trading partner. But all of a sudden, Brexit and the kind of dislocation that it creates is in many ways going against all grounds of pragmatism and rationalism that the British are quite often known for. Having said that, let me also say that what animates Brexit is a kind of a resurgent English nationalism. Now, when I mention English nationalism, I refer to England because the United Kingdom is actually 4 different nations. There is, of course, England, there's Scotland, there's Wales, and there's Northern Ireland. So what really animates Brexit is a particular kind of English nationalism, a very kind of, an assertive patriotism. The Winston Churchill has quite often been invoked in all of these things. But the interesting thing that a lot of people who are Brexit observers have pointed out to is that the enthusiasm that English nationalism has for wanting to distance itself from Europe is something that is not shared by other nationalisms. So Scottish nationalism, for example, the most famous proponent of Scottish nationalism was a man who just died recently, the famous actor Sean Connery, who acted in many of the James Bond movies. In fact, who was the original James Bond, is one proponent of Scottish nationalism, in case you're interested. But the point that I'm really making is that Scottish nationalism, for example, has clearly expressed a desire to be part of the European Union. Many people are suggesting that since Brexit has now happened, it is highly likely that Scotland may break away. So you might have another referendum. The last one that was held was back in 2014. There might be another referendum, and there may be the possibility of Scotland ending the union with England and re-entering the European Union. So interestingly, what you have is Brexit representing the possibility of the breakup of Britain. Now, that term that I just used, the Breakup of Britain, is actually a title of a book written in 1977 by a Scottish historian, Tom Nairn, the Breakup of Britain. And I think it's pretty prescient in terms of what we are witnessing. For all we know, this is an imminent possibility that might be witnessed in the next few years. So once again, if I can quickly go over the points that I've just made, I talked about 2 manifestations of Brexit. These 2 manifestations of Brexit are in terms of this love of America across the Atlantic, and this kind of a nostalgic reminiscence of trying to reconnect with the empire, the Commonwealth. Both these manifestations of Brexit seek to pull Britain away from the proximity of its immediate neighbors, which of course is Europe. We of course cannot remember that Britain, of course, is very much part of Europe. But having made that point, the further point that I made was that Brexit is in many ways a manifestation or is animated by an English nationalism that brings it into conflict with Scottish nationalism and Irish nationalism, most importantly. Now, having made this point, let me talk about a book that I recently read by a Portuguese novelist. It's by the name of the novelist is José Saramago. Now, the book is an interesting form of imagination. The book is called The Stone Raft. What happens in the book is that all of a sudden, the Iberian Peninsula, so if you've got your geography right, the Iberian Peninsula is that part of Europe that consists of Spain and Portugal. So the Iberian Peninsula breaks off from Europe from the Pyrenees. So the Pyrenees is the mountain range that divides the Iberian Peninsula from the rest of Europe. Of course, there's France on the other side. So what happens in this novel is that the Iberian Peninsula breaks off from the continent of Europe, and it becomes an island of its own, a raft. Now, when it becomes a raft, it starts floating off into the Atlantic, and all kinds of interesting things happen. And the story in the novel is of four characters who, along with their dog, traverse the whole Iberian Peninsula, driving from Portugal to Spain and back to Portugal, and trying to understand what exactly is going on. Now, something of that kind is happening to the UK. It's become a raft. It's become a raft that wants to float away from Europe, and kind of perhaps cross the Atlantic. And once it's crossed the Atlantic, wants to kind of perhaps go and dock near America, Trump's America. Of course, there won't be Trump anymore. But I've tried to use the idea of the stone raft in Jose Saramago's book to understand the Brexit raft, if I can call it that. Now, something very nasty will happen to this Brexit raft before it even enters, the treacherous waters of the Atlantic. It is highly likely that, as I said a little while ago, Scotland will break away. Northern Ireland would perhaps want to become part of the Republic of Ireland. It's been a huge contentious problem. The problem of Northern Ireland, there are these 6 counties which are also referred to as Ulster. It was only 22 years ago that the mass violence that was experienced in the Northern Ireland was resolved through something called the Good Friday Agreement. What Brexit can do is perhaps raise those problems all over again, give rise to the troubles and the violence that was put away, thankfully, 22 years ago, with 23 years ago actually now, with the Good Friday Agreement. So what I'm really trying to bring up here is that what Brexit has done is that it's opened a can of worms. It will create many more problems than it can even possibly solve. It's this kind of a wishful desire on the part of people, and quite often, when you have a wishful desire, this strong yearning, people will start realize, once the thing has been done, it's only after a point that people start realizing, well, it wasn't really worth it all. And I think perhaps a lot of Brexiteers, to their regret, will realize at some point that it perhaps wasn't worth it, that the cost of all of the whole Brexit project will perhaps just be too much. So essentially, the point that I'm making is that with a lot of enthusiasm, with a lot of euphoria, people who are supporters of Brexit have welcomed the idea of leaving the European Union. They feel that in some way the European Union was shackling them, that it was taking away from their freedom. And one of the most important points that Brexiteers kept making was this idea that they needed to reclaim their sovereignty. Okay, so take back control was one of the most famous slogans that was coined. So every time the Prime Minister Boris Johnson would be asked, take back control of what? And he would say, our money, our borders, and our policies, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, the point that I'm making about Brexit is that it's quite a remarkable kind of a project which doesn't have too much kind of a rational underpinning to it. A lot of it is based on a certain kind of emotion, the idea of a certain kind of nation that has suddenly re-emerged and is wanting to now reclaim the sovereignty that it had given up to the European Union. Now, having made this particular point, let me also make 2 further linked points. Now, let me also say that if there's something which isn't clear, please do kind of raise your hands or indicate that you want to ask me a question, and I'd be very, very happy to stop and try to respond to that question. But let me make 2 further points. These 2 further points are that despite this, this strange nature of the project, there was a genuine grievance underlying Brexit. I mean, the grievance that animated it had a very genuine kind of a tinge to it. The people who have a certain kind of animus towards Europe, the people who felt that there was something wrong, at heart, the grievance that they had was a very genuine grievance. And it is important, however much one is opposed to Brexit, as someone like me who is completely opposed to Brexit, and I've put this forward in my book, it is important to acknowledge that there is a certain genuineness of the grievance which gave rise to the project. So I hope I've made myself clear. Despite my disdain towards Brexit, despite my fears and my misgivings and all the criticism that I can kind of pluck up and throw at it, I would acknowledge the fact that there was a concern that people had, and a concern which politicians both in Britain and Europe never addressed. I will try to, look at what these genuine grievances are. Which brings me to my second point. And the second point is that this is perhaps the tragedy of Brexit, that the genuineness of the grievance has manifested itself in the kind of a rise of hatred. So there's been a spiral of hatred towards especially the immigrant. So the idea seems to be that the immigrant really is the source of our problems. People who are coming in from Europe, for example, the Poles and the Romanians, and Turkey, for example, has also been invoked as a great threat to the UK. So one of the things that I've noted about Brexit in all these years that I've been observing it and the book that I've written is that it has unleashed a very vehement kind of anger. It's unleashed a certain anger that is almost visceral, an anger towards the immigrant, an anger towards anyone who is opposed to Brexit. So let me just give you an example of how this anger has manifested itself, and again, very tragically. I think a week before the referendum happened on the 23rd of June, 2016. Just a week before the referendum, a Labour MP, a woman called Jo Cox, who was stabbed to death in her constituency in Northern England by a man who shouted Britain first. Now, think about that. I mean, this is just 1 week before the Brexit referendum. There's a man who in a British street is stabbing a British MP who was opposed to Brexit, and he shouts Britain first. Now, this is also what President Trump said in his inaugural 4 years ago, in his inauguration. He said America first. Now, the point that I want to make is that this really underlines the dangers of renascent nationalisms. What they do is that in their desire to put their nations first, they tend to relegate humanity to the last. Now, whoever you may be, whether you're a British or American or Indian or New Zealand or whatever, there is a certain kind of humanity that underlies us. And the point that I want to make about the problems of the nationalism project gone too far is that it is so eager to put its nation first that it quite often relegates humanity to the last. Now, this is one broad observation that I've just made about, Brexit and the manifestations of various kinds of hatreds. Simultaneously, a lot of people who have been observing Brexit have pointed out that there has been a tremendous spiral of violence on British streets. So, a certain kind of general intolerance. A lot of this comes from social media, which, again, I wish there was no social media actually in the world, and perhaps the world seemed to be a much safer and more friendly sort of a place. But the various movements, the campaigns that were arguing in favor of Brexit had a huge social media presence. And as a result of this social media presence, one of the things that they did was that they seem to have injected a vehement hatred into the larger discourse. Now, as a result of this hatred, what has happened is a kind of a breakdown of dialogue and the possibilities of being able to talk about something in a sensible sort of a way, which will bring me, especially towards the end of my discussion. I will want to talk about this a little more. Let me just keep track of the time as well, because I want to end in my monologue in 45 minutes and open things up for questions. So the point that I'm really making is that what again I find very distasteful about the whole Brexit phenomenon is the fact that it has given rise to tremendous levels of hatred. Now, one man who is often kind of a lot of the blame is pinned on him is a man who has been in the news quite a lot and who was Boris Johnson's special advisor. Boris Johnson, by the way, of course, is the British Prime Minister. His special advisor was a man called Dominic Cummings. Now, there's a certain dark genius behind this man, Dominic Cummings. Those of you who don't know much about him, let me just say a few things which you might have heard of in the news. Now, last year in May, when the lockdown had been imposed across the world, and the lockdown was pretty severe in the UK, and of course the lockdown has been reimposed in the UK because it has really been reeling under the worst effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Cummings was accused of violating the lockdown by traveling something like 400 miles from London, where he was, to a northeastern English town called Durham, where his parents lived. Now, when he was asked why he did that, he said, well, he was suffering from the virus, and he wanted to take his child, I think 3 years or 4 years old, make sure that his child was looked after by his own parents, which is a worthy thing. We often ask our parents to look after our children. Grandparents and grandchildren get along great with each other, and it's wonderful to see grandparents and grandchildren get along great with each other. But the point was that this man had broken um, the lockdown rules. Not only that, I mean, he traveled to another town a little far away from Durham, a town called Barnard Castle, which is a delightful town for tourists. And when he was asked why he did that journey, his excuse was bizarre, to say the least. He said that after the virus, he felt that his eyesight was not was not good enough. He was testing his eyesight on the road to see if he could make the journey back to London. Now, this is, it's farcical. Anyone who can hear an excuse of this kind will know that it's a lame excuse and it's a farce. But the point is that what it brought up is Cummings was very much the genius behind Brexit. He's the one who masterminded the whole thing. If you've watched a movie called, I've forgotten the movie actually, it's on Channel 4 movie. The person who plays the character, I mean, Benedict Cumberbatch is the actor who plays the role of Dominic Cummings, and he's portrayed as a very ruthless person. But the point really is that there's a certain kind of a ruthless streak behind someone like Cummings, who masterminded Brexit, and that ruthless streak has transplanted itself into the larger body politics. So what we now have is a certain kind of ugliness, a certain kind of macabre, almost a certain kind of a looming, menacing threat of violence. Now, let me give you an example of this. Sometime last year, one person, I've forgotten the name of that person, but he's actually an editor of a publication called Spiked, actually suggested that there should be mobs on the streets to ensure that Brexit gets done. So in a way, what he was saying was that he was expressing a certain surprise at the fact that you didn't have violent mobs on the street, that people were not expressing their discontent at the fact that Brexit hadn't been done so far. And he was almost expressing a desire that he wished that there were mobs on the street. Now, as you can see, there's a parallel between this desire that is being expressed and what we witnessed on the Capitol, I think 2 weeks ago now, or perhaps 10 days ago, when you had the violent insurrectionary mob, apparently incited by Donald Trump, moving towards the Capitol, breaking into the building, and thankfully, of course, a lot of people are saying that the intent was to take hostages. But the point that I'm making is what we now have in mature democracies, as they're often referred to, the US and UK, supposedly mature democracies, is you have a certain kind of a mobocracy, the rule of the mob out onto the streets. And this, for me, would represent some of the excesses of Brexit, this desire that people get things done outside normal parliamentary procedures. So related to this particular point that I want to make, and again, the British Prime Minister can be held responsible for this, time and time again, he would actually excoriate the British Parliament for stymieing the desire of people to be rid of Europe. So, a lot of his plans were scuttled by Parliament, which is exactly what a Parliament is meant to do. A legislature is actually meant to check the excesses of the executive. This is what we refer to as a balance of powers and checks and balances and so on and so forth. But the populism of Boris Johnson was such that within the Parliament, he would actually excoriate, criticize the British Parliament for stymieing and preventing the wish of the British people from being implemented. And the wish, of course, was the desire to be rid of Europe. So the point that I'm really making about Brexit is that it has resulted in a great spiral of hatred, a spiral of hatred that has manifested itself especially towards immigrants. And this brings me to the whole point of the title of my talk, which is There Ain't No Black in Brexit. Now, the reason why I have decided to title it There Ain't No Black is because, as I said, what animates, what gives Brexit the momentum is a particular kind of English nationalism, a renascent English nationalism. And the danger of this is that it is very disdainful towards a movement like the Black Lives Matter, which happened across the Atlantic. So when the Black Lives movement, it reached a certain kind of a crescendo in May and June this year, after the killing of which city was in it? I'm bad with names, and can someone remind me the killing of the man who had a policeman's knee on his neck, and he said he couldn't breathe. I can remember every single detail, but I can't remember the name of the person.
Was it Minneapolis, sir?
So the city was Minneapolis. The name of the person
George
who died
Floyd.
very tragically.
George Floyd.
So, thank you, George Floyd. I mean,
George
this is
Floyd.
something. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for reminding me. It's very strange that I can remember every single detail. It's Minneapolis, and the police officer with his knee on this person's neck, and it was very tragic to watch that. But the point that I'm making is that when the Black Lives Matter movement reached a crescendo after this very tragic incident, it had its repercussions across the Atlantic. But Brexiteers, or the vast majority of them, would express a certain kind of a disdain towards this. So one of the important figures in the British government, when he was asked about his opinion about what he felt about people taking the knee, in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, many people took the knee, went down on their knees, and he said that he didn't like the idea at all. The only person that he would bow down, or he would go down on his knees in front of, would be the Queen, and the other person he said was his wife when he proposed to her. Now I thought that this actually represents the disdain towards people of color in the whole Brexit project. Now, if you've noticed what I've been trying to say, at the same time, I've said two different things. On the one hand, a little while ago, I expressed I acknowledged the genuine grievance that underlies Brexit. And then what I've been trying to say is that Brexit manifests itself in a particular kind of spiral of hatred, a spiral of hatred towards immigrants, and a certain kind of a disdain towards people of color, especially blacks. So there is a certain kind of racism that Brexit has really kind of given rise to. And this really makes someone like me very concerned, because what it does is that it holds out a certain kind of a threat to democracy itself. And most importantly, one of the things that undergirds democracy is the idea that all of us are equals. So in that sense, I find the whole Brexit project an extremely disturbing kind of a project. Let me say two or three more things about this, and then I'll try to wind up. One of the aspects of Brexit, I mean, what has made it what made it so much of a success was the social media momentum behind it. Now, as a result of this social media momentum, you had people being targeted in terms of their social media profiles on Facebook and so on and so forth. And there was a lot of misinformation. So people were being fed lies, all kinds of lies, and they were being misled. Let me give you a concrete example of one of these lies and misinformation. Misinformation that was fed by Dominic Cummings himself, the man that I referred to a little while ago. So the good people of the UK were told that if they exited the European Union, they could save £350 million per week, and that those £350 million per week that was saved could be channelized into funding the National Health Service, for example, or things that could be done within the UK. Now, this was a complete fabrication. This figure was a complete fabrication. There was no substance to it. There was no truth to it. But what the Brexit campaign did was that it put this figure on a red bus, a bright red bus that you have in the UK, and that the bus traveled and the message traveled with it. Now, again, this brings me back to the point that there is a certain kind of willful misinformation that is going on. The willful misinformation, which is really kind of misleading people and not giving them the facts. This particular willful misinformation, as I'm calling it, was effective in terms of convincing people that their lives would be better if they were to leave the European Union. Now, I've read a few economists, and most of them are projecting that the British economy will shrink, that people's lives will get more difficult, that the amount of paperwork that will now be involved as a result of Britain's leaving the European Union will mean that it will affect British trade and so on and so forth. But the point that I'm really bringing up is that a movement or a political movement like Brexit, for me, represents everything that is wrong with what we have witnessed. It has many similarities with Donald Trump and the many lies and fake news that he has quite often taken recourse to. The idea that the American election was stolen, that it wasn't free and fair, and so on and so forth. So what we really have is a successful, so-called supposedly successful movement, because they've affected Brexit, being able to bring about its success on the basis of what I call willful misinformation. All right. Now, having said that, what I'm also suggesting is that there is a certain kind of supremacism that is at work here. The idea of there ain't no black in Brexit. the idea, the way in which there is a disdain towards immigrants, people who are not considered to be sufficiently English enough. It's a bit like, people being put on the touchstone of patriotism. If you are patriotic enough, if you pass muster, you will be considered to be part of, of the larger project. Now, there's a danger here. The danger that we are witnessing all in many, many societies across the world, where people who are not considered to be sufficiently patriotic enough are considered to be, lesser mortals and subjected to some kind of violence and so on and so forth. So again, in line with this point about, there ain't no black and Brexit, there has been a remarkable rise in Islamophobia in the UK. I mean, there are kind of clear indicators. An organization called Tell Mama, which monitors some of this, the hatred that Muslims are subjected to. Not only Islamophobia, but there's also been a great deal of discussion of the rise of anti-Semitism in the UK. As a result of this, especially the British Labour Party has been accused of not being able to handle anti-Semitism enough. So the story that I'm really kind of trying to tell is that what Brexit is all about is it's like a genie that has come out of its bottle. And all genies live in bottles. And the bottle was a shiny bottle which had a label affixed to it, the label of Cool Britannia, a label that was put there by a former British Prime Minister called Tony Blair, who I'm sure you must have heard of. He took UK along with the US into the war in Iraq, and there were disastrous consequences of that. But the point that I'm really making is that what Brexit has done is that it has unleashed a whole kind of all kinds of racism, racisms that were always contained but never countered by British multiculturalism. Okay, so British multiculturalism is something that a lot of people talked about, and the point that I'm making about British multiculturalism now is that what it always did was that it contained but never countered various forms of racism. So racism against blacks, racism against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism would also be manifestations of racism. It just kind of bottled it and kind of put a lid on the bottle. And what Brexit has done is that it's taken the lid off the bottle and have kind of unleashed it. And what you have is this kind of rise of all of different kinds of racisms, which is extremely sad because people have expressed their concern at the way in which there's been a rise of hatred, this kind of intolerance, the inability of people to actually be able to talk to each other in a sensible sort of a way. So once again, my point about Brexit and racism and its attitude towards blacks and peoples of color is that British multiculturalism, a worthwhile project, but a naive project, which never, as I said, countered, but merely contained racism, just kind of bottled it up. The English as a people are known to be pretty reserved and keep themselves bottled up. So that would perhaps be another analogy. And what Brexit has really done is that it has unleashed and unbottled all these various forms of racism. And it's all kind of come tumbling out. The manifestations of this, this racism has been in terms of especially the position that the British Conservative Party has taken, and also for that matter, the Labour Party. So they've all contended with their own different kinds of racisms. So Labour, of course, as I said a little while ago, has been accused of not having done enough to counter anti-Semitism. Many, many accusations were made against the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn. There was an Equality and Human Rights Commission investigation against the Labour Party, which found the Labour Party mishandling complaints of anti-Semitism. Similarly, the Conservative Party has been accused a number of times of Islamophobia. Boris Johnson himself has made many comments which are clearly Islamophobic. So once in one of his articles, he was a journalist with the Daily Telegraph, and he still writes columns for the British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph. In one of his articles, he suggested that women who wear a burqa look like letterboxes and or bank robbers. Now, what one clearly sees is a certain kind of disrespect that is being shown to the way that people choose to attire themselves. The particular choice of attire, the clothes that they want to wear. And you see Johnson in a very crude sort of a way expressing his attitude towards women who decide to wear the burqa. Various other forms of Islamophobia have been expressed by members of the UK, United Kingdom International Independence Party, UKIP, of course, which became the Brexit Party, and now I think has now been renamed into something else. And the important figure there is a man called Nigel Farage. But to kind of bring this discussion to an end, and perhaps this will be my final point, which I'll spend 4 or 5 minutes speaking about, and then I'll open the floor for questions, is that a lot of people who support Brexit say that it's all about democracy. Well, of course, yes, it is about democracy. But what people forget is that democracy is not just elections. It's not just about a referendum, which is what really got the whole Brexit project kicking off. Democracy is so much else. All right. So the point that I'm really making at the very end here is that you can differentiate between a core of democracy, okay, the principles which can be considered to be central to democracy, and then you have something that I refer to as a democratic surround. Okay, so the point that I'm making is a distinction between a core kernel of democracy and a democratic surround. If you want to visualize an analogy, you can think about the Earth and the atmosphere around the Earth. We all know that the atmosphere around the Earth is very important in terms of its sustaining life on Earth, and we all know that because of the pollution of the environment, the accumulation of carbon and carbon gases, there's a rise in the temperature and the greenhouse effect, as it's called. So, drawing from that analogy, what I'm also suggesting is that democracy is not just about elections. Okay, all populists will claim that they won elections, which is fine, of course, yes. That is certainly a part of democracy, but that's not all that democracy is all about. I mean, if one were to confine democracies to just elections and the holding of a referendum, as Brexiteers often do, it would be what I would call a caricaturing of democracy. We all know what a caricature is, when one part of a person's appearance is exaggerated and accentuated. The other aspects of democracy are equally important. What are those other aspects of democracy? Free speech is one aspect of those democracy. Human rights would be another aspect of this democracy. So all these aspects of democracy, free speech and human rights and so on and so forth, dissent. Let me just take up three. Let me just take these three up: free speech, human rights, and dissent. These I would put in the democratic surround. Okay, the surround around the core of democracy. Now, what I'm suggesting is that across the world, what we're witnessing, whether it is in India or the UK or in the US, in many other countries of the world, what we are witnessing is a vitiation of the democratic surround. Now, as a result of this vitiation of the democratic surround, this kind of a degeneration of the surround, the democratic atmosphere, what is happening is that the core kernel of democracy itself will die off. So if one really wants to protect democracy, which I think a lot of people should really be talking about, in the interest of dialogue, in the interest of equality, in the interest of decency, in the interest of equal respect and mutual living, it is important to focus on the democratic surround. Because what most populists across the world are doing, and I would include someone like Boris Johnson there, who is a dyed-in-the-wool populist, is that by winning elections, and this knack that populists have of winning elections, they're all pretty good at winning elections. Once they get into power, they start vitiating the democratic surround. By vitiating the democratic surround, they are killing off the democratic core. This is really the danger that I find in something like Brexit, or for that matter, Trump across the Atlantic in America. Thankfully, Trump has been defeated. Hopefully, this will be the end of Donald Trump. And a lot of people suggested that it won't be the end of Trumpism as a phenomenon. We don't know. But what I'm really emphasizing at the end of my discussion is that a country must rely on the voices of its most vulnerable to understand where it's going. Okay, remember what George Floyd said when the policeman's knee was on his neck. He said, "I can't breathe." Remember those very, very powerful lines. Now, those of you who've been inside coal mines, and I have been down one or two, will know that there's a proverb called the canary in the coal mine. Now, what that means is that when coal miners go into mines, they keep a caged canary with them. Now, when the levels become very toxic inside the coal mine, the canary dies. The death of the canary signifies that it's not safe to go any further. Okay, the coal miners must stop there and go back. What I'm suggesting is that quite often the minorities in a country are their canaries in the coal mine. Most nationalisms, I began this lecture by talking about renaced nationalisms. Most nationalisms tend to kind of ride roughshod over their minorities. What they forget is that the minorities really indicate to them the dangers to their democracy. When George Floyd said that he couldn't breathe, I think it's important for people to realize that the effects of his inability to breathe will spread to everyone else. It won't just be confined to people who are disprivileged or underadvantaged. To invoke a phrase that we are really in this together, that's something that all of us should realize, and that's something that Brexiteers don't seem to understand in their disdain towards people of color and blacks. So the point that I'm trying to end this discussion with is the idea that it's important for societies to listen to the canaries in their coal mine. Because what are those canaries in the coal mine saying? They're saying, like George Floyd, that they can't breathe. Why is the situation rising? The situation is rising is because renascent nationalisms are plunging and plumbing lower and lower depths. Look at the depth to which our democratic discourse has reached. And I'm not just talking about one country in the world, I'm talking about most countries in the world. I'm talking about the US, I'm talking about UK, and I'm talking about India, three countries that I've really been thinking about of late. But look at the way in which the democratic discourse has plunged. It is not just anti-intellectual, it is downright unintelligent, and I would even go to the extent of calling it stupid. Okay, to use a strong word. So what this plunging of the discourse suggests, where there's name calling and so on going on, it suggests that what nations are doing is that they are plunging to ever lower abysmal depths. By plunging to ever lower abysmal depths, they are endangering, of course, their minorities and their most vulnerable. But people should not be under the impression that people should not really be under the impression that the adverse effects that one set of people are feeling will not come to them. At some point, it is bound to envelop everyone. We are, as I said, all in this together. The sooner we understand that, the better it is for all of us as we continue to forge our collective existence on this planet. And we've made quite a hash of it in these 2 decades of the 21st century. Let's hope we can make and hope for better things. I'll stop there, and I would be very happy to answer questions.
Thank you, sir, for this very lucid presentation. Now, anybody with a question?
So can I go ahead?
Yes.
Yes.
So it's not a question, but probably just a comment about what Dr. Ali said. I was probably thinking in context of how you said that, not just the United Kingdom, but the Europe, like I'd just probably say that Western democracies have have come to be characterized by multiculturalism when it comes to how they approach diversity and how they want to manage diversity. I mean, multiculturalism has been the biggest tool, the most important tool that they use to manage diversities in their particular democracies. And what I've been able to see from whatever I've been able to read is that it's a completely abysmal failure of the said diversity management approach. I mean, this is just an outcome. The way we saw Brexit play out, I mean, when the Brexit referendum took place, it was not astonishing, but I mean, about 80% people in the England voted for Brexit, which is like, I think it's quite a huge percentage.
52% was the percentage of people who voted for Brexit. 48.1% voted against it.
Yeah. So, I think it was sort of, it was just a depiction of how people had given into that that entire rhetoric of a mythical golden age of sovereign nation states, where how you have racial homogeneity, you have cultural homogeneity. So I think it's not something that just came about in 2016. It has been there for a very long time, but it's just that people were now able to step out, and not just in the United Kingdom or in British context, in the English context, but everywhere in the world. Like, this is a trend that has now come on. Like, people have been able to take it out from their private spheres into their public spheres. Like, it's not that people were not bigots, they were always bigots. They can just now say it in public that yes, I'm a bigot, I'm a Trump, like I support Trump, I support Boris Johnson. I think right now, like after coronavirus, people are sort of not very happy with Boris Johnson here, but I still see people, you know, who are going to justify how the government has been going on about things. And as far as race and the Brexit vote is concerned, I think it was just in the making. It's just a complete failure of how they have approached their diversity. They have not given the right kind of space to their minority to come about and actually be a part of the mainstream. There has been this avid compartmentalization, which I've seen, like which I mean, I wouldn't say I've read enough, but that is what has like come out in my own reading, is that they've tried to compartmentalize. They have laid so much stress on multiculturalism that they've forgotten that that is what is actually failing them, and it is failing them really miserably. This is what happened in France. This is what happened in Sweden. This is what happened in the UK. They try to look at the minority as people who will, they only have two options: either they need to assimilate or they need to make their own pockets, just like it has happened in England. You have certain pockets where you have Labour MPs, and then everybody's speaking the same language. Asians are speaking the same language, other ethnic minorities are speaking the same language. But then you have pockets in the UK where you would not, like, I would, wearing a hijab, I'd be very scared to walk into a particular neighborhood which I know I shouldn't be here. Like, I shouldn't be here. If something happens, you know, I'll probably not make it out alive. And that is how it is. So it's probably not even the Brexit. I just think it's been a very long time in the making, a very, very long time in the making. And even with the opposition, it is, I think these are certain characteristics which probably somebody needs to put on paper. That is very common, and interestingly, even in the global south, you know, there are these, like, there is a very weak opposition even in the United Kingdom right now. I think probably last year 7 Labour MPs quit the Labour Party. Seven sitting parliamentarians quit the Labour Party because they accused Jeremy Corbyn of having supported the Brexit, which he did in a way. And they accused him of being, they said that he was the far left and they didn't want to be with the far left anymore, despite the fact that he was supporting the Brexit, and they were going to create a centrist party, which didn't come about. I don't know how 7 people are going to do it, but that is how it is. I mean, there's no opposition, there's no strong opposition, just like we do not have in India or in the US. But anyhow, US is still trying to do something better. So it's just, I mean, I like to see Brexit as a big moment, but it's not as important as I'd like to think it is when it comes to how race is perceived, dealt with, or how it operates in United Kingdom. It is there. It is probably just when people moved in from the private to the public, but it has always been there. You know, it has always been in the making. Multiculturalism has completely failed. It has just run out its course. And it's probably high time, if they get a Labour government the next time, or probably a centrist government, if it somehow emerges someday, they might be able to move into better diversity management approaches, and maybe race the next time wouldn't be such an issue, race and discrimination. That's it.
Well, let me say that I completely agree with the idea that two things that you said. Well, firstly, the failures of British multiculturalism. I'll say something about that. Secondly, Brexit was certainly a long time in the making. It didn't just emerge. Now, one of the things that really contributed to this Brexit in the long time in the making was the Europhobic British press. Now, the tabloid press in British, which is atrocious in terms of the way they hound people. The Sun, for example, owned by Rupert Murdoch, and many others. So, I mean, there was a constant drip feeding into the British imagination of the horrors of the European Union. And when I began, I said, you know, it's the EU is a worthy project because it realizes the dangers of renascent nationalism. And Brexit is an example of a renascent nationalism, renascent English nationalism that hates multiculturalism, that hates Europe, that hates immigrants, that hates blacks, that hates Muslims, that is anti-Semitic. So, I mean, the interesting thing about you know, the patriotism of the Brexiteers, I mean, they are, you know, they will go to great lengths to express their love for their country and excoriate the patriotism of others, is that the patriotism of their country is premised upon the hatred of everyone else. I mean, their neighbors, the immigrants. I mean, you juxtapose this. It's very strange. How can one's love of one's country be premised upon so much hatred towards other people who you know, apparently do not belong to your country? There have been great philosophical ideas on love, for example, Christian ideas of love. Plato wrote a whole dialogue on love, and what one finds is this very strange aspect of this patriotism. And Johnson is one of those people who keeps talking about his patriotism. The other Johnson, Samuel Johnson, was the one who talked about patriotism being the last refuge of the scoundrel. And I think that idea of Samuel Johnson certainly applies to Boris Johnson, certainly. So British multiculturalism, I think, was extremely superficial. It was pretty much a kind of a labeling exercise. Its origins have to do with the way that the British managed their diversity in their colonies. They did it pretty badly, and of course, those chickens have come home to roost in the form of British multiculturalism. So yes, there's a lot of rethinking, but let me just add one more point to it, which is that when Johnson got his huge jumbo 80-seat majority in the December 2019 elections, which I wrote about in a few places, I mean, I was astounded. How could he convince people? Given his own self-aggrandizement, the man that, he's a narcissist. There's so much about him, which is typical. I mean, how could people believe this man, who's known to have lied in his newspaper columns, and people, especially in the North, took him seriously. So he actually breached the Labour Red Wall in the North. Seats which had for 80 years, 90 years been voting Labour, switched loyalties to the Conservatives. And I just kind of held my head, and in disbelief, I said, how can this be happening? How can people trust a man to get Brexit done who, promises one thing in the morning and forgets about it in the evening? And what this represents, I think, is the utter rottenness of democratic politics. And I think there's a certain kind of revival or a kind of a rejuvenation of the political that we need. I mean, people like Johnson can get away with it. He is pretty much Trump on the other side of the Atlantic, and you have your variants of Trump. You have your Bolsonaros and your Viktor Orbans, and I can go on. But this is very sadly the state of the world right now. It is a situation in which these despots do not brook dissent, do not want to dialogue. It's always about saying what you want, not listening to other people. And I think this represents a very difficult phase in the politics of the world that we are in right now. It will change, but it's probably going to get worse before it gets any better, unfortunately.
Thank you, sir.
Abdullah Mazad, you want to ask a question?
Hello, sir. Good afternoon, sir.
Hi.
I'm from Bangladesh. So just I want to add a comment actually, sir. Just, last time I was reading a book, and there was giving a reference. The book name is Cecil Rhodes. It was just, I want to give a reference, then I want to give my opinion. They're saying that, Anglo-Saxon people, wherever, just I'm giving the translation part of it. I read it in another language. They're saying that Anglo-Saxon people are the best people in the world, and wherever they will go, just they will do the best thing for the world, then and they will make the change around the world in positive way. Just I want to give their, as you are talking about the different nationalism. So this is the first line. I was reading from one of the book. This maybe it could be a bit outside the context. And the thing is, wherever the British people has gone, wherever the British people are, have made in their imperialism, this is in their blood. They just want to, imperialism, looted everything from there, and they are going away from there. Let's say if we talk about this India, some subcontinent in 1757, whenever they make this imperialism in this part of this world, in this point 24% or 25% of GDP of the around the world was, from this part of the world. But whenever they left this part of the world in 1952, completely they left 1952. That time it was only 3% of this world. This is one thing. Another thing I want to make another comment I want to make is, let's say, they have done so many bad things. Crime against humanity. Let's say kill many people around the world. Let's say 1857. Then in 1943. There are many ways they have, committed crime against humanity. But my comment is, it is being never discussed. As you know, the history is being written always with the victor. So I mean, it is, I don't know why it is being discussed. I mean, this is just I want to share. And another thing I want to say is, actually this is in the British people blood. I mean, as I was saying, whenever they have been gone, just they have looted the thing, and they have I mean, they have made the mountain of wealth and in their own country, and they have made other country poor. And I mean, this I want to add. Actually, I have many things to more say. Just I want to add this more. Thank you very much.
Okay, Abul Kalam, let me just say one thing. I mean, it would be a little strong to say that something is in people's blood. I mean, because what that reduces it reduces it to a certain kind of primordialism. I mean, the British have done nasty things across the world. I mean, in our part of the world, it's a continent which we share. I mean, they have ravaged it. Not just this, but wherever the British Empire went. So, of course, the wrongs of the British Empire have been brought out, and they must be brought. I mean, what really mystifies me, what really kind of strikes me about Brexit is the fact that Brexiteers are still so proud of the British Empire. I mean, they still think that it was a force of great good. You try telling that to us, who suffered, and we of course we have a different point of view. But let me also say, in all fairness to the British, of course there were bad things that the empire did. There are bad things that all people have done to other people. Okay, so I don't think that we should kind of place the sole monopoly of badness on one set of people. I think it's important to acknowledge that all of us are capable of the worst kinds of things. At the same time, all of us are also capable of great deeds of humanity. So there have been people within the UK who have acknowledged the wrongdoings of the British Empire. Let me give you an example of this. The British parliamentarian and man of letters Edmund Burke, okay, who wrote extensively about India, about Bengal, and the ravaging of Bengal. One of the points that he made about the East India Company was that this is a great crime that the East India Company is doing to Bengal. He talked about Dhaka Muslim, for example. He talked about southern India. He talked about all these parts. So the point that I'm really making is that there is a certain kind of, appeal to a British sense of fair play, appeal to the rule of law that can be made in order to bring out these injustices. Okay, to go back to your point about the sense of British supremacy, again, I've been struck by it because I think one of the cabinet members, I've forgotten his name, actually claimed that we are better than the Germans, we're better than the French. So, I mean, this kind of arrogant conceit, this the sense of superiority is something which is very perturbing. And I think that what this perhaps represents the worst excesses of Brexit. I think the minister in question was Gavin Williamson, if I'm not wrong. He actually said that we're much better as a country than these other countries. I mean, that they actually got the vaccine earlier, that they'd started their vaccination program. I think the UK was the first country to begin the vaccination program. And he actually made this point. When I was listening to the news, I must say, a little dumbfounded. How can people actually claim this sense of superiority? So I think perhaps people need to be told that a little humility is always very, very important. I wouldn't agree with the idea that it's in anyone's blood. I think political projects are projects of, decisions that people take which are wrong decisions. That's how I would put it. I think all political decisions are, when people decide to go one way or the other. Sometimes we make the right decisions, quite often we make the wrong decisions. I think that Brexit was certainly a wrong decision. The decision to extend the British Empire was, of course, certainly a wrong decision. The only thing we can do is try to make as many good decisions as we can to outweigh the wrong decisions that we inevitably make. So I just wanted to kind of make that particular point.
Yes. So the thing is just, I mean, as I was saying, I mean, never ever they are accepting or acknowledging that, I mean, they commit crime against humanity. Just, I mean, last time I was also reading an article regarding this. I mean, recently there are some of the people, I mean, some number of the people is just accepting it actually. I mean, I don't know, just if you as you are saying, I mean, just this is my personal opinion. I mean, just whatever I have studied the history of the British people, wherever they did, I mean, I couldn't find, maybe, I mean, I can be wrong. I mean, couldn't find a wrong, I mean, positive thing about their imperialism. I mean, just wherever they go, I mean, as I was saying, just I would say again, maybe, I mean, in their nationalism, it is in their, not in their blood, maybe I'm saying in another way, but I mean, always they think like that. Whenever, in case of Bangladesh, I mean, in case of Bangladesh, India, or Pakistan, they never, I mean, think this India subcontinent people as the same level people up there. I mean, they are just underestimating them. I mean, still they are doing the same thing as I was saying. I mean, they were same before also. They are same. I mean, now also. That's what I'm saying. I mean, still they are in their blood.
This is what we call racism, I mean, racism, this idea that one race is superior to other races. And I think there's a lot of racism inherent in Brexit. But at the same time, let me also say that, I mean, we must always evaluate societies according to their goods and bad sides. Now, the one good thing about societies like the UK is that there is a sense of fair play that can be appealed to. All right. There is a certain kind of liberalism of institutions. There is the possibility of a free press that can be appealed to. Now, the point is that I think that sense of fair play has to be appealed. I mean, this is something that Gandhi, for example, said when he talked about his idea of civil disobedience. The point that Gandhi made was that why did he engage in civil disobedience? The point was to break the law, to say that this is a bad law. Not only that, but to also appeal to the good sense of the oppressor. Okay, Gandhi makes this point very clearly, in the whole question of civil disobedience. I mean, why do people engage in civil disobedience? They willfully break the law. I mean, criminals break the law on the sly, right? The civil disobedient breaks the law because the civil disobedient wants to kind of manifest and bring out how bad the law is. And the person engaging in civil disobedience is someone who is willing to accept the consequences of that, unlike a criminal who wants to break the law and get away with it. Now, in addition to that, Gandhi is also someone who is engaging in what he calls satyagraha, or the search for truth. Now, the search for truth is something that can never be done individually. It is something that is always done dialectically. Now, again, in Gandhi, in his conversations with the British, is suggesting that the British, of course, are the oppressors, but he is simultaneously appealing to a British sense of fair play, a British sense of justice. Now, this is not just the British. A sense of fair play is perhaps to be found in all of us. Okay, and if we really want to get along in the world, I think it's important for people to actually slowly, gradually bring out this sense of fair play and justness that is in all of us. Let me make one quick point to kind of elaborate this. A psychoanalyst that I read recently said that there are 3 levels of human being. Okay, there is the first superficial level in which we are outwardly polite to each other. Okay, and then there is a lower level where we can really be nasty and mean. All our anxieties and uncertainties are brought out. And then there is a lowest level, that's substrate of humanity. I think what Brexit represents is the movement of politics away from the first level. And, the nastiness comes from those uncertainties that exist within all of us. All of us are capable of great wrongs. At the same time, I think politics must be pitched at the level where people acknowledge the basic decency in every single one of us. Okay.
Thank you. Anybody else? No more questions? Indeed. So perhaps we don't have any more questions. If you want to add something, maybe we can conclude.
So you want me to kind of do a kind of summing up?
If you want to, I mean, if there's something you would like to add, otherwise we can conclude here.
Okay, I mean, if I can just, in 1 or 2 minutes, basically, sum things up. As I said, I've been worried by trends like Brexit and Trump, which I often consider to be similar to each other. And the reason why I'm very worried about this is because I think what it is leading people to is that it's willfully misguiding people in terms of political priorities. It's bringing up the idea that nation states can exist in supreme, sovereign, splendid isolation from each other. I mean, at least the British believe that they can do that. Now, clearly that's not possible anymore in the kind of 21st century that we live in. What has really been kind of underlined is the interdependence of not just nations, but individuals. So if I can just kind of make 2 quick points. Recently, Pope Francis, I think his Christmas address, said that the narrow walls of nationalism will not be able to keep the virus out, that it's important for people to understand and cooperate with each other. Now, clearly, people who are ardent Brexiteers and who are ardent nationalists don't understand this. I mean, they want to build up walls. Mr. Trump, of course, wanted to build that big wall all across the American-US border. Brexiteers want to kind of wall in the UK. Okay, want to prevent people from coming, from people, immigrants coming into their own country, and they feel that this is a country that is exclusively meant for them. I don't think any country is exclusively meant for anyone. People have always crossed boundaries. I think the crossing of boundaries has resulted in some of the finest achievements. So the problem with something like Brexit is that it's too much about narrowing down. It's all about walling in. It's all about separating off, hiving off. That's one point. The second point is that I think what a lot of Brexiteers don't really kind of appreciate is the fact that every single one of us is bound to every single person else in the world. A point that was made by the South African epidemiologist Salim Abdul Karim. The point that he said is that it is very clear from the coronavirus pandemic that my health is dependent upon the health of every single person out there in the world, people who I may never meet, people whose existence I may not even be aware of. Now that, I think, in a very beautiful sort of way underlines the fact that you may be living in Senegal, you may be living in South Africa, you may be living in Swaziland or Australia or New Zealand, but this recent pandemic has underlined the fact that every processes like Brexit seek to rupture this realization. Okay, and therefore it's a source of great concern, especially for someone like me who's been watching it and of course who's been writing about it. I think nationalism really is one of those forces in the world which has resulted in people being unable to understand the similarity that underlies all of it. I just want to kind of make that final point.
All right. It was a pleasure listening to you. Thank you so much for this brilliant presentation on Brexit and its repercussions.